November 1183. Inside the fortress of Kerak, a wedding celebration is underway. The bride is Isabella, half-sister to Jerusalem's dying king. The guests are drinking, feasting, dancing in the great hall. Outside, Saladin's army, siege engines, thousands of soldiers, catapults hurling stones that shake the walls. And somewhere in that castle, the newlyweds are huddled in a tower that Saladin, in a bizarre show of chivalry, has ordered his men not to bombard. The rest of the fortress? Fair game. The Crusader Kingdom is hanging by a thread. Their king is dying of leprosy, barely able to sit upright. And yet somehow, impossibly, Baldwin IV is about to force one of history's greatest military commanders to retreat, without ever fighting him. This is the story of how a dying king humiliated Saladin at Kerak. But first, you need to understand why Kerak mattered, why Saladin was willing to drag an entire army across the desert to take it, why this fortress, more than any other, had become an obsession. Look at a map. Kerak sits on a rocky spur in the mountains of Transjordan, modern-day Jordan. It doesn't just overlook the landscape, it dominates it. Every trade route between Damascus and Egypt passed beneath its shadow. Every caravan carrying spices, silk, gold, every pilgrim making the journey toward Mecca. Christian eyes, watching Muslim roads. For Saladin, this wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an insult. A permanent threat lodged in the side of his empire like a blade that couldn't be removed. And the man holding that blade? Reynold of Chatillon. Remember that name. Write it down. Because Reynold wasn't just a crusader lord. He was a problem, a provocation wrapped in chainmail. A man so reckless, so aggressive, that even other crusaders kept their distance. This was a knight who had once tortured the Patriarch of Antioch, smeared honey on his wounds, and left him on a rooftop for the insects to feast on. Why? Because the Patriarch refused to fund one of his military adventures. This was a man who broke truces like other men broke bread, who saw every peace agreement as a temporary inconvenience, who looked at the fragile balance between Christian and Muslim powers and thought, I can tip this over. And his masterpiece of provocation, the Red Sea raids. Picture it. Reynold somehow, and historians still debate exactly how, launched ships on the Red Sea, Christian vessels, sailing waters that Muslims considered their own, raiding merchant ships, threatening pilgrims, coming within striking distance of Medina and Mecca, the holiest cities in Islam, threatened by a pirate operating from a desert fortress. Saladin had made an oath, a personal vow. Reynold of Chatillon would die by his own hand, not captured, not ransomed, killed. But first, he needed to take Kerak. November 1183 gave him something better than an opportunity. It gave him a gift. Intelligence filtered into Saladin's camp. A wedding was being planned at Kerak. But not just any wedding. Isabella of Jerusalem, half-sister to King Baldwin IV himself, was marrying Humphrey IV of Turan. The ceremony would take place inside the fortress. And the guest list? Every major noble in the Crusader Kingdom. Stop and think about what that means. The entire leadership of your enemy, the princes, the lords, the military commanders, all gathered in one place, behind walls you've been desperate to breach. If you moved fast enough, struck hard enough, you wouldn't just capture a castle, you'd capture a kingdom, hostages worth more than gold, leverage that could end the Crusader presence in the Holy Land, the kind of victory that changes history. Saladin didn't hesitate. He marched from Damascus with everything he could muster, a major field army, thousands of soldiers, cavalry and infantry, engineers and sappers, and most importantly, siege engines, mangonels, catapults, battering rams, the heavy machinery of medieval warfare designed for one purpose, breaking walls and breaking wills. The army moved fast, faster than anyone expected. By the time the wedding guests at Kerak realized what was happening, it was already too late to run. The drums were audible from the walls, the dust clouds visible on the horizon. And then, emerging from that dust, an army that seemed to stretch forever. Saladin had arrived, and he'd brought hell with him. Inside Kerak, panic should have taken hold, would have taken hold in most places. But Kerak wasn't most places, and these weren't ordinary people. The wedding continued. Think about the audacity of that. Catapults are being assembled outside your walls. An army is surrounding your fortress, and inside, the music keeps playing. The guests keep dancing. The bride and groom exchange their vows while stones begin to crash against ancient masonry. Defiance, denial, perhaps both. But there was also calculation. The walls of Kerak were strong, immensely strong, built on bedrock, designed by engineers who understood that this fortress would be tested. The outer defenses could absorb punishment. The garrison knew their business. And help, surely help was coming, wasn't it? The siege began in earnest. Saladin's engineers positioned their machines with professional precision. The bombardment started, a rhythmic thunder that shook dust from the ceilings and made conversation impossible. Stone after stone after stone, crashing against walls that had stood for decades. And then something strange happened, something that would be remembered for centuries. Stephanie of Millie, the mother of the groom, the lady of Kerak, did something unexpected. She gathered food from the wedding feast, the finest dishes, delicacies prepared for the celebration, and she sent them out. To Saladin, not as a bribe, not as surrender, as a gift, a gesture so bizarre, so utterly out of place in the middle of a siege that it demanded a response. Saladin received the food, and according to the chronicles, he smiled. Then he asked a question. Which tower were the newlyweds staying in? When he received the answer, he gave an order. That specific tower, the one sheltering the bride and groom, would not be targeted. His catapults would spare it. The rest of the fortress remained fair game. But the newlyweds, they would celebrate their wedding night without stones crashing through their ceiling. Chivalry, in the middle of a siege, from the commander who had sworn to kill the lord of this very castle. Medieval warfare was complicated, but don't mistake courtesy for weakness. Saladin wasn't playing games. He wanted Kerak. He wanted Reynald's head. He wanted those hostages. The bombardment of every other section continued without mercy. His engineers probed for weaknesses. His soldiers prepared for assault. The wedding feast became a siege. The celebration became a trap. And somewhere far to the west, a dying king received the news. Baldwin IV was 22 years old. He had been king of Jerusalem since the age of 13. And he was dying. Leprosy. The word alone carried terror in the medieval world, a disease that ate flesh, destroyed nerves, left its victims disfigured and isolated. Baldwin had been diagnosed as a child. His tutor noticed that the young prince felt no pain when his arm was injured during play. No pain, because the nerves were already dying. By 1183, the disease had ravaged him. His face was disfigured. His hands were useless. Some accounts suggest he had lost fingers entirely. His eyesight was failing. He could barely sit upright without assistance. This was the man who would save Kerak. When word reached Jerusalem that Saladin was besieging the fortress, that the wedding party was trapped, that the entire nobility of the kingdom was in danger, Baldwin didn't hesitate. He couldn't ride a horse. He could barely stand. His body was failing in ways that would have broken most men. But he was still the king, and his people were in danger. He ordered the army assembled, and then he did something that borders on the unbelievable, something that chroniclers recorded with awe, that historians still discuss with amazement. Baldwin IV led the relief force himself. Not from a horse. He couldn't manage that anymore. He was carried on a litter, a covered platform borne by servants, the medieval equivalent of a stretcher. A dying man, commanding an army, being carried toward one of the most dangerous military commanders in the world. The march began. The road from Jerusalem to Kerak was not kind. Rocky terrain, mountain passes, desert stretches where the sun hammered down without mercy. For a healthy army, it was a grueling march. For a force led by a man who had to be carried on a litter, it was something closer to impossible. But Baldwin moved anyway. Picture the scene. Dust rising from the column, knights in chainmail sweating beneath the November sun, infantry trudging forward, shields on their backs, spears clutched in tired hands. And at the center of it, all a covered litter, swaying with each step of the men who bore it. Inside that litter, a king who couldn't see properly, couldn't grip a sword, couldn't sit a horse, a man whose body had betrayed him in every way a body can betray someone. And yet, he was coming. Word traveled fast in the medieval world. Saladin had spies, scouts, an intelligence network that stretched across the Holy Land. Within days, perhaps hours, he knew that a relief force was on the move. He knew who was leading it. And here's where the story gets interesting. Because Saladin now faced a choice, a military calculation that would define this campaign one way or another. Let's break it down. Option 1. Stay at Kerak, continue the siege, finish what he started. The walls were strong, yes, but they weren't invincible. Given enough time, enough bombardment, enough pressure, they would crack. The hostages inside were worth the effort. The chance to capture the Crusader leadership in one stroke was worth almost any risk. But time was the problem. Sieges are slow. That's their nature. You surround a fortress, cut off supplies, pound the walls, wait for starvation or despair to do what your soldiers cannot. Weeks, months, sometimes years. Baldwin's army would arrive long before Kerak fell. Option 2. Abandon the siege. Withdraw before the relief force arrived. Save the army for another day, another opportunity. Live to fight when the odds were better. But that meant giving up. Walking away from a prize that was almost within reach. Letting a dying man, a king who could barely lift his head, chase you off like a stray dog from a feast. The humiliation would be immense. Option 3. Fight. Stay at Kerak. Let Baldwin come. Meet his relief force in open battle while the garrison watched from the walls. Tempting, right? Saladin had the larger army. He had veteran soldiers, experienced commanders, momentum on his side. In a straight fight, on ground of his choosing, he should win. Should. But here's what Saladin understood, what made him one of the great military minds of his age. Battles are chaos. Anything can happen. A cavalry charge hits at the wrong angle. A commander falls to a stray arrow. Morale breaks for reasons no one can explain. And Saladin wouldn't be fighting one enemy. He'd be fighting two. The relief army in front of him. The garrison behind him. This is the nightmare scenario for any besieging force. You're caught between the hammer and the anvil. The fortress you've been trying to crack suddenly becomes a threat at your back. The defenders you've been starving for weeks can now sally out, hit your rear, disrupt your formations at the worst possible moment. Military history is littered with armies that were destroyed this way, caught between two forces, unable to concentrate, picked apart from both directions. Saladin hadn't survived this long by taking unnecessary risks. So what did he do? He did the math. Kerak's walls were holding. The garrison showed no signs of surrender. The relief force was getting closer every day. And even if he won a battle against Baldwin, even if he crushed the relief army completely, his own forces would be bloodied, exhausted, depleted. Too weak to continue the siege. Too weak, perhaps, to hold what he'd gained. The calculation was brutal but clear. There was no path to victory here, not this time. not with a relief force bearing down and a fortress that refused to crack. Saladin gave the order. The siege engines fell silent. The catapults stopped their rhythm. Soldiers began breaking down camps, loading equipment, forming marching columns. The army that had seemed so overwhelming, so unstoppable, began to move. Away from Kerak, away from the wedding guests still trapped inside, away from Raynald of Chatillon, who would live to provoke another day. Saladin was retreating. Now, let's be very clear about what this was and what it wasn't. This wasn't cowardice. Saladin was many things, but coward wasn't one of them. He had fought battles against terrible odds. He had risked his life countless times. He would go on to conquer Jerusalem itself, to defeat the greatest Crusader army ever assembled at Hattin, to cement his legend as one of history's most formidable commanders. This was calculation. Pure, cold, military logic. A siege that couldn't be completed in time. A relief force that changed the equation. A risk-reward ratio that no longer made sense. Saladin chose to preserve his army, to withdraw in good order, to fight another day when the conditions favored him. It was the smart decision, the professional decision, the decision that any competent commander would make. And it was humiliating anyway, because here's what everyone saw. Here's what the chronicles recorded. Here's what people whispered about in courts and camps across the Holy Land. A dying king, a leper who couldn't ride, couldn't fight, couldn't even stand without help. A man whose body was rotting while he still breathed. He had marched toward one of the most powerful armies in the region, and that army had fled. Not fought and lost, not negotiated a withdrawal, fled, retreated, turned and marched away without ever crossing swords with the relief force. The optics were devastating. In the medieval world, reputation was everything. A commander's aura of invincibility was worth more than 1,000 soldiers. The belief that someone couldn't be beaten, that opposing them was futile, that belief won battles before they started. Saladin had spent years building that reputation. Victory after victory, campaign after campaign, the unifier of Muslim forces, the scourge of the Crusader states, the man who would drive the Christians into the sea, and now? Now he had retreated from a man who had to be carried into battle on a stretcher. The whispers started immediately. In the courts of Europe, they called it a miracle, a sign of divine favor. Proof that God protected his faithful servants, even when those servants were dying of incurable disease. In the Muslim world, the explanations were more practical. Military necessity, tactical wisdom, the long game. But the sting remained. Saladin had been checked, stopped, forced to back down by Baldwin the Leper. Inside Kerak, the relief was overwhelming. Imagine it. Days of bombardment, stones crashing against walls, the constant thunder of siege engines, the knowledge that a massive army surrounded you, that escape was impossible, that eventually, inevitably, those walls would fall. And then silence. The catapults stopped. The drums faded. The dust clouds that had marked the enemy camp began to drift and disperse. Scouts reported movement, not toward the walls, but away from them. They were leaving. The wedding guests emerged from their shelters. The garrison stood down from high alert. Somewhere in that fortress, Isabella and Humphrey, the newlyweds whose tower Saladin had spared, could finally breathe. They had survived. Not through military genius, not through some brilliant tactical stroke. They had survived because help came, because a dying king refused to abandon them, because Baldwin IV, against all odds, against all reason, had dragged himself across the desert to save them. The celebration that followed must have been something to witness. Relief and joy and disbelief all mixed together. Tears and laughter and prayers of thanksgiving. But Baldwin couldn't stay long. His body was failing. The march had cost him more than anyone would fully know. He had pushed himself beyond every limit, and now the bill was coming due. The king returned to Jerusalem. The nobles scattered back to their estates. Life in the Crusader Kingdom continued, fragile and precarious as ever. And Saladin? Saladin went home to plan. Because here's the thing about Saladin. He learned from his mistakes. He adapted. He came back. The humiliation at Kerak in 1183 wasn't the end of the story. It was barely the middle. Within a year, Saladin would return. Same fortress, same target, same determination to crack those walls and kill the man behind them. 1184, another siege, another army surrounding Kerak, another bombardment shaking the ancient stones. And once again, Saladin would face the same impossible problem. What happened in the second siege? Did Saladin finally break Kerak? And what ultimately became of Baldwin, Raynald, and the fortress that defied the greatest commander of the age? The answers might surprise you, less than a year later. Saladin was back. Same fortress, same walls, same defiant garrison staring down from the battlements. But this time, Saladin had learned. This time he came prepared for a longer fight. The second siege of Kerak began much like the first. Army surrounding the fortress, siege engines positioned, catapults resuming their deadly rhythm, stone after stone after stone crashing against walls that had already weathered one storm. But there was a difference this time. A crucial one. Baldwin IV was weaker. The disease had continued its relentless work. Every month stripped away more of what remained. His eyesight was nearly gone now. His limbs were failing. The man who had marched to Kerak's relief in 1183 could barely leave his bed in 1184. Could he do it again? Could he summon another army, endure another march, force another retreat? Saladin was betting he couldn't. The siege pressed harder. The bombardment intensified. Engineers probed the walls for weaknesses, looking for the crack that would bring everything down. Inside Kerak, the garrison held firm. But for how long? Without relief, without hope of rescue, even the strongest walls eventually fall. Days passed, weeks, and then, incredibly, impossibly, word came again. A relief force was forming. The Crusader Kingdom, battered and bleeding, was scraping together another army, and yes, Baldwin was involved. Not leading this time, he physically couldn't, but organizing, commanding from afar, refusing to let Kerak fall. The dying king wasn't done yet. Saladin faced the same calculation he'd faced before, the same impossible math. Storm the walls now, risk catastrophic losses, potentially get caught between garrison and relief force, or withdraw, preserve the army, accept another humiliation. He chose withdrawal. Again. Think about what this meant. Twice. Saladin had besieged Kerak twice, brought massive armies twice, deployed siege engines, endured the logistical nightmare of desert warfare, invested enormous resources into cracking this single fortress. Twice he had walked away empty-handed. And both times, the shadow of Baldwin IV had driven him off. Not Baldwin's sword, not Baldwin's military genius on the battlefield, just his presence, his refusal to quit, his impossible supernatural determination to keep fighting when his body had every reason to surrender. The legend grew with each passing month. In Europe, troubadours sang of the Aus leper king who defied Saladin. In the courts of France and England, Baldwin became a symbol, proof that faith and courage could overcome any obstacle. The story improved with each telling. The details grew more dramatic. The dying king became almost mythical. And in the Muslim world, Kerak became an obsession. Saladin couldn't let this stand. Couldn't let one fortress, one stubborn, impossible fortress, define his legacy. He had unified Egypt and Syria. He had built the most powerful military force the region had seen in generations. He would not be remembered as the man who couldn't crack Kerak, but the fortress would have to wait, because Baldwin IV was dying. Everyone knew it. The king himself knew it. And when he died, the Crusader Kingdom would face a succession crisis that might tear it apart from within. Saladin could be patient. He could wait for his enemies to destroy themselves. Baldwin IV died in 1185. He was 24 years old. 24. Let that sink in. Everything he accomplished, the battles, the sieges, the desperate defense of his kingdom, he did before most people today have finished graduate school. He ruled for over a decade while his body disintegrated around him. He faced down the greatest military commander of his age and won. Twice. And then he was gone. The kingdom he left behind was fragile. Factions competed for power. His nephew, a child, inherited the throne and died within a year. The crown passed to Guy of Lusignan, a man many considered weak and incompetent. The vultures began to circle. And Reynold of Chatillon, the lord of Kerak, the provocateur who had caused so much of this chaos, he was still raiding, still breaking truces, still poking the dragon. In 1186, Reynold attacked another caravan, a rich one. Some sources say Saladin's own sister was among the travelers. Whether that's true or not, it was the final straw. Saladin had waited long enough. The Crusader Kingdom was weak, divided, led by a king who couldn't command respect. The time had come. The year of catastrophe. Saladin assembled the largest army he had ever commanded. This wasn't a siege force. This was an invasion. He marched into Crusader territory with one goal: total destruction. The Crusaders responded by gathering every soldier they could find. Knights, infantry, mercenaries, everyone. They marched to meet Saladin near a place called Hattin. It was a trap. Saladin chose the ground. He controlled the water sources. He waited until the Crusader army was exhausted, dehydrated, desperate. And then he struck. The Battle of Hattin wasn't a battle. It was an annihilation. The Crusader army was destroyed, not defeated, destroyed. The king was captured. Dozens of nobles were taken prisoner. The military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, the elite warriors of the Crusader states were virtually wiped out. And Reynold of Chatillon, he was brought before Saladin personally. The chronicles record what happened next, with chilling detail. Saladin offered water to King Guy, the traditional sign of protection and mercy. Then he turned to Reynold. No water for him. The oath Saladin had sworn years before, that Reynold would die by his own hand, was about to be fulfilled. According to the accounts, Saladin struck Reynold himself. His guards finished the job. The lord of Kerak was dead. And Kerak itself? After Hattin, there was no one left to defend it. No relief force coming. No dying king to march to the rescue. The garrison held out as long as they could. Months, by some accounts. But the end was inevitable. Kerak fell in 1189. The fortress that had defied Saladin twice finally surrendered. But here's the thing. By the time Kerak fell, it didn't matter anymore. Saladin had already taken Jerusalem. He had already redrawn the map of the Holy Land. The Crusader Kingdom that Baldwin IV had fought so hard to protect was a shadow of its former self. Kerak's fall was an afterthought, a footnote to a catastrophe. So what does it all mean? What can we learn from a dying king, an impossible siege, and a fortress that held just long enough? The answer is more relevant than you might think. Let's go back to that moment. November 1183, Saladin's army withdrawing from Kerak. A dying king being carried back to Jerusalem on a litter. What actually happened there? Strip away the legend. Strip away the troubadour songs and the romantic embellishments. What's left? A military decision. That's all. Saladin looked at the situation. Strong walls, determined garrison, relief force approaching, and made a calculation. The siege couldn't be completed in time. Fighting a battle with a fortress at his back was too risky. Withdrawal was the smart play. He wasn't afraid of Baldwin. He wasn't intimidated by the leper king's reputation or divine favor or supernatural courage. He was doing math. Cold, professional, military math. And the math said, leave. So why do we call it a humiliation? Because context matters. Perception matters. In the medieval world, in any world, really, how things look is almost as important as what actually happens. And this looked bad. A king who couldn't walk. A king whose flesh was rotting off his bones. A king who should have been dead already, by any reasonable medical standard. That king assembled an army, marched across the desert, and forced the most powerful commander in the region to retreat. Without fighting. That's the part that stings. If Saladin had met Baldwin in battle and lost, that would be one thing. Battles are uncertain. Anyone can lose a battle. But to withdraw without even trying? To see the relief force coming and simply leave. It looked like fear. It looked like weakness. It looked like the mighty Saladin had been scared off by a man who couldn't lift a sword. The reality was more complicated. But reality rarely wins against a good story. Here's what Baldwin understood that many commanders don't. Sometimes showing up is enough. He didn't need to defeat Saladin in battle. He didn't need some brilliant tactical masterstroke. He just needed to change the equation, to make the siege untenable, to force Saladin into a position where his only options were bad ones. Stay and risk destruction. Leave and accept humiliation. Baldwin couldn't control which option Saladin chose, but he could make sure both options were painful. This is a different kind of victory. Not the glorious cavalry charge, not the decisive battle that ends a war, just pressure applied at the right moment in the right way. It's not the kind of victory that makes for exciting songs. But it worked, and Baldwin did it twice. There's something else worth considering, something that often gets lost in the drama of sieges and battles. Baldwin knew he was dying, not in the abstract way that we all know we're dying. He knew it specifically, concretely, immediately. He could feel his body shutting down. He could see himself deteriorating in the mirror, assuming he could still see at all by that point. Every decision he made was shadowed by that knowledge. Every march, every battle, every diplomatic negotiation. He was playing a game he couldn't win. The best he could hope for was to delay the inevitable, to buy time, to hold things together just a little longer, and he kept fighting anyway. That's the part of the story that resonates, not the military tactics, not the strategic calculations, the sheer, stubborn refusal to quit. His body was failing, his kingdom was crumbling, his enemies were closing in, and Baldwin IV kept showing up, kept making decisions, kept dragging himself onto the battlefield, literally dragging himself, carried on a litter, because giving up wasn't an option. What do you call that? Courage? Stubbornness? Desperation? Maybe all three. Maybe it doesn't matter what you call it. The effect was the same. Compare that to Saladin. Saladin was brilliant, strategic, patient. He understood that wars aren't won in a single battle. They're won through the accumulation of advantages over time. He could afford to withdraw from Kerak because he knew the bigger picture. He knew the Crusader Kingdom was weakening. He knew Baldwin couldn't last forever. He knew his moment would come. And he was right. 1187 proved him right. Hattin proved him right. Jerusalem falling proved him right. In the long run, Saladin won everything. But in November 1183, at the walls of Kerak, he blinked first. He made the smart decision, the professional decision, the decision that any competent commander would make. and history remembered it as a humiliation. Because Baldwin, broken, dying, barely human anymore, had refused to blink at all. There's a lesson here, maybe several lessons. The obvious one: determination matters, showing up matters. Even when you can't win outright, you can change the equation. You can make your opponent's choices harder. You can refuse to make things easy for them. But there's another lesson, darker and more complicated. Baldwin's defiance at Kerak was magnificent. It was inspiring. It made for incredible stories that people still tell almost 1,000 years later. And it didn't save his kingdom. 4 years after Kerak, Baldwin was dead. 2 years after that, his kingdom was shattered. The fortress he fought so hard to protect eventually fell anyway. The enemy he humiliated went on to conquer Jerusalem. Sometimes you can do everything right and still lose. Sometimes the best you can achieve is delay. Sometimes showing up, fighting back, refusing to quit. Sometimes it only buys you time. But time matters too. The years between 1183 and 1187 mattered. The people who lived during those years mattered. The children who grew up, the families who stayed together, the lives that continued because Kerak didn't fall. They mattered. Baldwin couldn't save his kingdom forever. Nobody could have. But he saved it for a little while longer. He gave his people a few more years. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that has to be enough. What happened to everyone else? What legacy did they leave? And why does this story still matter today? So, where did everyone end up? Baldwin IV died in 1185, 24 years old. He was buried in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the holiest site in Christendom. For a brief moment, he rested in peace. 2 years later, Saladin conquered the city. What happened to Baldwin's tomb after that is unclear, lost to history, like so much else. Reynold of Chatillon got what was coming to him, beheaded by Saladin personally after Hattin, the oath fulfilled. The provocateur silenced. Whatever you think of Reynold, and opinions vary wildly, he died the way he lived. Violently, dramatically, unrepentant. Saladin himself died in 1193, just 6 years after his greatest triumph. He had given away so much wealth during his lifetime that there wasn't enough left in his treasury to pay for his funeral. The man who conquered Jerusalem died nearly broke. His empire fragmented almost immediately. His sons fought over the pieces. Within decades, the unified Muslim state he had built was gone. And Kerak? The fortress changed hands several times over the centuries. Crusaders, Muslims, Mongols, Mamluks, Ottomans. Each wave of conquerors recognized its strategic value. Each one held it for a while before the next wave came. Today it's a tourist attraction. You can walk the same walls that Saladin bombarded. Stand in the same halls where Isabella and Humphrey celebrated their wedding. Look out over the same desert landscape that Baldwin's relief force crossed. The stones remember, even if people forget. But here's what strikes me about this story. Everyone involved knew they were living through something temporary. Baldwin knew his life was ending. Saladin knew the Crusader states were weakening. The garrison at Kerak knew they couldn't hold forever. The wedding guests knew the siege might be their end. And yet they all kept going, kept fighting, kept making decisions as if those decisions mattered. Because they did matter, not forever. Nothing lasts forever, but for the moment, for the people involved, for the world as it existed right then. Baldwin couldn't cure his leprosy, couldn't reverse the decline of his kingdom, couldn't prevent the eventual fall of Jerusalem. But he could march to Kerak. He could force Saladin to withdraw. He could save those people on that day. So he did. We tend to think of history as inevitable. Looking backward, everything seems predetermined. Of course, Saladin conquered Jerusalem. He was Saladin. Of course, the Crusader states eventually fell. They were outnumbered and far from home. Of course, Baldwin died young. He had leprosy. But the people living through these events didn't know the ending. They couldn't see the trajectory. They only saw the present moment and the choices available to them. Baldwin chose to fight, chose to show up, chose to drag his ruined body across the desert because people were counting on him. He didn't know if it would work. He didn't know what Saladin would decide. He only knew that doing nothing guaranteed failure, and doing something, anything, kept hope alive. That's not a military lesson. That's a human one. The siege of Kerak in 1183 wasn't the biggest battle of the Crusades. It wasn't the most strategically significant. In the grand sweep of history, it's a footnote, a brief delay before the inevitable. But something about it endures. Maybe it's the image of the wedding feast continuing while catapults thunder outside. Maybe it's Saladin's strange chivalry, sparing the tower of the newlyweds. Maybe it's the idea of a dying man being carried into battle on a litter, refusing to give up even when his body had already surrendered. Whatever it is, people keep telling this story, keep finding something in it that resonates. A reminder, perhaps, that determination matters even when victory is impossible, that showing up counts even when you can't win, that the right choice isn't always the one that leads to success. Sometimes it's just the one you can live with, or die with. November 1183. A wedding under siege. A king who couldn't walk. An army that marched away without fighting. Saladin made the smart decision. The logical decision. The decision that preserved his army for future victories. Baldwin made the impossible decision. The decision that shouldn't have worked. The decision that defied every reasonable calculation about what a dying man could accomplish. And for one brief moment, the impossible won. Not forever. Nothing lasts forever. But for that moment, at that place, against those odds, a leper king stared down one of history's greatest commanders, and the commander blinked. That's the story of Kerak. That's why it matters. Not because it changed history. It didn't, not really. The ending was already written. But because sometimes the ending isn't the point. Sometimes the fight is the point. Sometimes standing up when you should stay down, showing up when you should give up, refusing to quit when every rational calculation says quit. Sometimes that's enough. It was enough for Baldwin. It was enough for the people he saved. Maybe it can be enough for us, too.